The imperial palace of Zephyria had witnessed many strange occurrences throughout its thousand-year history, but nothing quite compared to the chaos that had erupted in the royal nursery over the past 6 months. Emperor Thalax, supreme ruler of the Zephyrian Empire, stood at the ornate doorway watching his latest attempt at childcare flee in terror. "Your Majesty," the fleeing Varaxian caretaker wheezed as she stumbled past him, her 4 arms clutching what remained of her singed uniform. "I cannot. The little ones are simply too destructive?" the Emperor supplied wearily, his scaled brow furrowing as another small explosion echoed from within the nursery. The caretaker nodded vigorously before scurrying away down the marble corridor, joining the long list of failed babysitters that now included representatives from 17 different species across the galaxy. None had lasted more than a day, with the Emperor's twin hatchlings. Inside the nursery, Prince Zix and Princess Nyx were engaged in what could generously be called playtime. The 2 baby dragons, each no larger than a house cat but possessing the destructive potential of a small starship, had discovered that their newly emerged fire glands produced particularly interesting effects when combined with the imported Altarian silk curtains. Emperor Thalax sighed, a sound that rumbled deep in his massive chest. As the most feared ruler in 3 star systems, he could command fleets, conquer worlds, and negotiate treaties that shaped the fate of billions. But 2 tiny dragons barely a year old had reduced him to desperation. "Sire," his chamberlain, a nervous centaurian with trembling tentacles, approached cautiously. "There is one more candidate. She arrived this morning from the Terra sector." The Emperor's eyes narrowed. "A human? We've never employed their kind in the palace before." "Yes, well," the chamberlain consulted his holographic notes. "She comes highly recommended. Apparently she has experience with what her species calls difficult children." Another crash from the nursery, followed by the distinct sound of what might have been a priceless vase meeting an unfortunate end, made the decision for him. "Send her in." Sarah Chen had worked as a pediatric nurse in Houston for 15 years before accepting the most unusual job posting she'd ever seen. When the Galactic Employment Bureau had contacted her about a childcare position requiring patients with energetic youngsters of non-human species, she had assumed it meant some sort of alien equivalent of hyperactive toddlers. She had not expected dragons. Standing barely 5 feet tall, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and wearing simple scrubs instead of the elaborate robes favored by previous caretakers, Sarah looked thoroughly unremarkable compared to the towering Emperor and his retinue of advisors. "The children are spirited," the Emperor explained, gesturing toward the nursery where smoke was now visibly seeping under the door. Sarah nodded calmly and walked toward the chaos. "May I?" Before anyone could respond, she had opened the door and stepped inside, closing it firmly behind her. The scene that greeted her was indeed spectacular. The nursery looked like a war zone decorated by an interior designer with a fondness for precious metals and rare crystals. Amidst the destruction, 2 small dragons were engaged in what appeared to be an aerial battle, breathing tiny jets of flame at each other while executing impressive barrel rolls around the room. They noticed her immediately, landing on opposite sides of the room and regarding her with large, intelligent golden eyes. For a moment, the nursery fell silent except for the gentle crackling of small fires throughout the space. Sarah looked from one dragon to the other, then did something that no previous caretaker had attempted. She sat down cross-legged on the floor, right in the middle of the chaos, and began to hum. It wasn't a particularly complex melody, just a simple lullaby her grandmother had sung to her decades ago. But something about the human voice, so different from the complex harmonics of other species, seemed to captivate the young dragons. Prince Zix tilted his head, his small wings folding against his sides. Princess Nyx crept closer, her curiosity overriding her defensive instincts. Sarah continued humming, slowly reaching into her bag to pull out what appeared to be a rubber duck. The dragons watched in fascination as she squeezed it, producing a cheerful squeak that echoed through the ruined nursery, Then she did something that would later be recorded in imperial histories as the moment everything changed. She laughed. Not the careful, respectful laughter of courtiers or the nervous titter of frightened caretakers. This was genuine, delighted, human laughter at the absurdity of sitting in a destroyed palace nursery, surrounded by baby dragons squeaking a rubber duck. The dragons looked at each other, then back at Sarah, and then, in perfect unison, they began to trill. A sound somewhere, between a purr and a chirp that no one in the palace had ever heard before. Within minutes, both dragons had crept close enough to investigate this strange new caretaker. Sarah gently stroked Zix's scales, while Nyx investigated the fascinating texture of human clothing with tiny, careful claws. Outside the nursery, Emperor Thalak stood frozen with his ear pressed to the door, listening to sounds he had never heard from his children. Contented chirping, gentle laughter, and what might have been. Was that a lullaby? When Sarah emerged, 3 hours later she carried a sleeping dragon under each arm. Both hatchlings were curled up against her shoulders, their small chests rising and falling peacefully. They were overtired, she explained matter-of-factly to the stunned emperor, and probably a bit overwhelmed by all the formal protocol. Children, regardless of species, need routine, boundaries, and someone who isn't afraid of them. The Kadir emperor stared at his peacefully sleeping offspring, then at the small human woman who had accomplished what beings from across the galaxy had failed to do. The position, he said carefully, comes with a substantial salary, full diplomatic, immunity and quarters in the East Wing. Sarah smiled, adjusting the sleeping dragons more comfortably. That sounds perfect, Your Majesty. Though I should mention, we'll need to baby-proof the nursery, and perhaps invest in some fire-resistant toys. As news of the human nurse's success spread throughout the imperial court, representatives from dozens of worlds began submitting requests for human childcare specialists. It seemed that humanity's greatest export wasn't technology or culture, but something far more valuable: the innate ability to see children as children, regardless of their species, and to respond with patience, creativity, and love. And in the imperial nursery of Zephyria, 2 small dragons dreamed peacefully for the first time in their young lives, while their human caretaker hummed ancient lullabies and planned tomorrow's activities, which would definitely include more rubber ducks.